Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to dive deep, really get into it with this potential political shift coming up in Canada,
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a big one.
with Pierre Poilievre poised to maybe become prime minister in 2025.
It's looking more and more likely.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've got a really fascinating Maclean's article here that actually predicts Poilievre is going to win.
And lays out some pretty significant potential changes he might make.
Exactly, and we're also going to be looking at some comments from a Reddit thread where people are just going back and forth about it all.
Oh, yeah, that's always a good time. Lots of strong opinions there.
Always. So our mission today is to use these sources to really understand what a Poilievre-led Canada might actually look like, and you know what it means for all of us, what it could mean for all of us.
Yeah, what would actually change in our lives if this guy wins?
Yeah.
Big question.
Huge question. So right off the bat, the Maclean's piece really goes all in. They were predicting a Poilievre win, maybe even a majority government.
Now they're not holding back.
No, they're not. And they're saying he'll probably move pretty quickly to make some changes based on his agenda.
Well, he's certainly got a lot of momentum right now. The Conservatives have been way up in the polls ever since he became leader.
Yeah, since September 2022, right?
Yeah.
It's been pretty remarkable. And the article really highlights this feeling among Canadians that things aren't working. Like a lot of people just feel like the country is on the wrong track.
It's interesting. They actually cite a poll in the article where 70% of Canadians said they agree with the statement that Canada is broken.
Wow, 70%. That's a lot.
Yeah, and even more surprising, 43% of the people who said that were actually Liberal voters.
So even people who typically vote for the other guys are feeling
Yeah,
that.
exactly. So you can see why a leader who's promising change would have a lot of appeal right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Someone who's saying, I can fix this. I'm the guy. So, okay, let's talk about the kind of change Poilievre represents.
Right. Well, he's a huge fan of Milton Friedman.
Okay. And for those who might not know, Milton Friedman was.
He was an economist who really championed smaller government. Like, he believed in free markets and minimal government intervention.
Okay, so less government involvement in the economy.
Exactly. And that's a pretty different approach than what Canada's used to. I mean, traditionally, we've had a more involved welfare state, where the government plays a bigger role in providing social services and supporting people.
Right, so this could be a pretty big shift.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes you wonder how he plans to square that circle.
What do you mean?
Well, can he really shrink the government's role while still meeting the expectations that Canadians have? Like, we're used to having certain benefits and social programs.
Right, like healthcare and education and things like that.
Exactly. So how does he plan to reduce the government's involvement without cutting those things that people rely on? It's a tough balance.
Yeah, how would that even work? So the article talks about Poilievre wanting to push resource development more aggressively.
Yeah, things like natural gas, pipelines, mines.
And particularly on Indigenous lands.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems to be a big part of his plan.
And he's been quoted saying he wants to create a small government with big citizens.
Which sounds empowering.
Yeah, but how does that actually play out in policy?
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about balancing economic development with Indigenous rights and protecting the environment.
That's the real question. It's going to be really tricky, and the potential for conflict is pretty high. I mean, on one hand, some Indigenous leaders might welcome this idea of more economic opportunities and, more control over their resources.
Yeah.
But there are others who prioritize things like environmental protection or who are opposed to any development on their traditional lands.
Right, that makes sense.
And they might push back hard. We could see more legal challenges, more protests, and honestly, it could put this whole big citizens idea to the test.
Yeah, it could reveal some limitations.
Exactly. And the article even suggests that Poilievre might be more willing to use the police to handle those protests.
Wow, so maybe this vision of empowered citizens comes with some strings attached.
It seems that way.
It's interesting to think about. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about housing.
Ah, yes. The hot button issue.
Always a hot button issue. But this is actually an area where Poilievre seems to be pretty popular. The Maclean's piece even calls it his strongest issue.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he's really been pushing this message that the federal government is making it way too hard to build homes.
Which is something a lot of people agree with.
Right. And he's got this concrete plan to get rid of the GST on new homes that cost less than $1 million.
Okay, so that sounds good for people trying to buy a house.
Yeah. But here's the catch. He wants to pay for that by cutting other federal housing programs.
Ah, so less government spending overall.
Exactly. It's that classic Poilievre move. Appealing to a specific group of people while still sticking to this core idea of shrinking the government.
That's a pretty consistent theme with him.
It really is. But it does raise some questions. Can he really fix the housing crisis with less government involvement?
Yeah, it's a complex issue.
Really complex. And you have to wonder if these cuts might end up hurting the very people he's trying to help.
Right. It's a bit of a gamble.
It is. And speaking of skepticism, we actually saw a lot of that in the Reddit thread we looked at. Like, a lot of people were commenting that they just don't believe any politician, even with good intentions, can truly fix something as complex as housing.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And a lot of the factors are outside of the federal government's control anyway.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that some of the things the Liberals have already done to address housing might start having positive effects right around the time Poilievre takes office.
Oh, that's interesting. So would he get credit for those improvements?
That's the question.
Right.
Or would people still blame him for any problems that are still around?
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. He could end up inheriting the successes or the failures of the previous government.
Talk about a political tightrope walk.
Hmm.
So let's move on to another big one. Poilievre's promise to defund the CBC.
Ah, yes. That's been making a lot of noise.
Yeah, this isn't just about cutting budgets. It's a bigger statement about what role the government should play in the media.
Right. It's really about his whole philosophy of smaller government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what does defund actually mean? The Maclean's article throws out a few possibilities, from significant cuts to basically shutting it down entirely.
Wow, that'd be huge.
They even mention the possibility of selling it off to private interests.
Which would obviously change the Canadian media landscape in a major way.
Yeah, that would be a complete shakeup. And the fact that there's so much uncertainty around his plan just adds to the tension. You can really feel the anticipation building as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, people are definitely paying attention. And it's a move that's definitely going to be controversial. Like, some people will love it and some people will hate it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Poilievre's supporters are probably going to be pretty happy about this, They see it as a win against what they consider to be, like, biased media.
Right, but then you have people who really value the CBC as a source of independent news, Canadian content, and they're understandably pretty worried.
Yeah, I mean, what happens if the CBC gets smaller or just disappears altogether?
Exactly. Do we just end up with a bunch of profit-driven networks like in the U.S.?
Right, and what would that even mean for, like, the quality of the information that Canadians are getting? I mean, that was a question that came up a lot in that Reddit thread we were looking at.
It's a legitimate concern for sure. People are really trying to wrap their heads around what the consequences might be.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the comments were comparing a Poilievre-led Canada to, like, a choose-your-fighter situation with the U.S.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, like implying that we might be headed down a similar path of, like, partisan division and all that.
Right. Just more polarization.
Exactly. And it really makes you think about how the information we consume and the way we debate issues might change if the media landscape shifts that much.
It's a big deal because it's not just about the CBC itself. It's about what it represents.
What do you mean?
Well, the CBC is often seen as like a pillar of Canadian identity. It's a symbol of the government supporting arts and culture.
Right. I can see that.
So defunding it could be seen as like a rejection of those values, which is something that a lot of Canadians care about deeply.
And speaking of values, the Maclean's article also mentions that Poilievre hasn't really committed to keeping those pharmacare and dental programs that the Liberals started with the NDP.
Oh, right. Those were pretty big initiatives.
Yeah, and he's been kind of vague about it, saying he doesn't want to ruin anybody's life, but also emphasizing his whole small government with big citizens thing.
So it's not clear where he stands.
Not really, and it seems like those two ideas might be kind of conflicting, don't you think?
Yeah, there's definitely some tension there. I mean, historically, voters tend to get pretty upset when governments take away benefits that they've been relying on.
Right, it can be a risky move politically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if Poilievre tries to make big cuts to social programs, he could face some serious backlash.
That's true. It'll be interesting to see how he handles that. Will he try to, like, trim the budget without actually cutting essential services?
Or will he just stick to his principles and risk alienating voters?
It's a tough call.
Yeah.
And, that Reddit thread we were talking about, it really captured the whole range of emotions people are feeling about this stuff. Like, there's a lot of skepticism out there. A lot of people are just like, here we go again with Canadian politics.
Yeah, that feeling of like nothing ever really changes.
Exactly. One commenter even compared it to a never-ending wheel of Canadian politics.
Yeah.
Like the same issues and the same political games just keep spinning around and around.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
Right. And then other people were worried about the impact of potential cuts to things like daycare subsidies.
Which would obviously affect a lot of families.
Yeah, big time.
So it seems like there's this underlying sense of cynicism and just fatigue among some voters. Like they just don't believe that things will actually get better no matter who's in charge.
And I get that, especially when you look at how complicated these issues are, like housing, healthcare, climate change.
Right, they're not easy fixes.
No, they're not. And politicians often make promises they can't keep. It's understandable why people would be skeptical. But what's interesting?
What's that?
Even though some of the comments were reflecting that weariness, that cynicism, there were others that expressed this real desire for change.
Really? Even if they didn't agree with everything Poilievre was saying?
Yeah, they saw him as someone who might actually shake things up, break away from the status quo.
Interesting. So it's not just negativity.
No, it's like there's this collective longing for a leader who's not afraid to take risks and, challenge the way things have always been done.
Yeah.
Even if it means there might be some bumps along the way.
That's a powerful sentiment. It speaks to this desire for authenticity and bold leadership. People are tired of the same old political games, and they want someone who's going to be straight with them and, actually do something.
Someone who's not afraid to make tough decisions.
Exactly. And Poilievre definitely fits that mold. He's not afraid of controversy, and he's definitely willing to make those tough calls.
Which brings us back to his whole approach to Indigenous issues. He talks a lot about empowering Indigenous communities, giving them more control over their own affairs.
Which sounds good in theory.
Yeah. But how does that actually work with his stance on resource development and, his potential willingness to use police force against protests?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
Like, how does he reconcile those things?
If he's serious about empowering Indigenous communities, he's going to have to find a way to balance their economic goals with their cultural and environmental concerns.
And he's going to have to do it in a way that respects their right to self-determination.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's going to have huge implications for the future of Canada.
It really is a lot to think about, and it makes you wonder how his approach to Indigenous relations might play out in other areas too, like what about land claims, settlements, and treaty rights?
Right, those are huge.
Could this focus on economic development lead to like a more, assertive approach to those negotiations?
It's definitely possible he might be more willing to push for settlements that favor development, even if it creates more tension with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, that's something to keep an eye on for sure. So, okay, let's bring it back to the CBC one more time.
Okay, yeah.
Because the Maclean's article suggests this isn't just about saving money. It's like a philosophical statement about the government's role in shaping public opinion.
Right, like should the government be involved in media at all?
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what a post-CBC Canada would even look like. I mean, would private media just step in and fill the gap?
That's the question. And would that be a good thing or a bad thing for Canadians?
Yeah, because some people in those Reddit comments were worried about a privately owned CBC.
Oh, yeah, they were saying it would be more about profits than public service.
Right, and they were concerned about biased reporting and a decline in the quality of the program.
Which are valid concerns for sure.
Definitely. But then others were pointing out that a lot of Canadians already get their news from, like, social media and online sources.
So maybe the CBC isn't as essential as it used to be.
It's a really interesting debate, and there are definitely no easy answers.
No, it's complicated, and it really highlights how much the media landscape is changing.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the future of Canadian culture and identity.
Like what happens to our shared stories and experiences if we lose a national broadcaster?
And how do we make sure that everyone in Canada has access to reliable information that isn't biased?
Those are big questions that we'll all be trying to answer as we move forward.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this potential political shift in Canada, we want to leave you with something to really think about,
Yeah, something to chew on.
Given everything we've learned about Poilievre's vision, his focus on smaller government and economic development, his stance on social programs and how he approaches Indigenous issues, and, of course, his plans for the CBC.
What stands out to you?
What are you excited about and what are you worried about?
Imagine for a second that he actually wins and he's the prime minister.
Yeah.
What changes do you think you would welcome and what changes would you push back against?
What questions would you want to ask him if you had the chance?
Because ultimately, the future of Canada is up to all of us.
We have the power to shape it through our votes, our voices, and our actions.
So let's use them.